Hello, Brent Eviston.
Hello.
How's it going today?
Very well. How are you?
It's good so far. I had some technical difficulties beforehand that we were sorting out there, but I think it's mostly okay now. You guys let us
Excellent.
know if at any point in time I start to sound weird or anything. Brent's setup is rock solid, so should
For
be good
now.
there.
For now.
So to those of you guys out there who are watching, please join us as we go through our third live streamed critique with Brent Eviston. Today we'll be breaking down some of the work submitted as part of his course, The Art and Science of Figure Drawing. For those of you who haven't been here before, the first half will be streamed here on YouTube for everyone to learn from for free. And then the second half of this will be for the students of the course. That link for the premium students or for anyone interested in the course is in the chat, and I'll put that in the description as well for good measure. If anyone is here that's part of the course already, you guys can just join that one so there's no like kind of break in the middle there as it goes over. Let me go ahead. I'm going to put a little banner up here so people know where they can find you, Brent,
Okay.
when they go to look for you on socials. Yeah, for those of you guys who don't know, who haven't been here for the other ones, Brent is a fantastically skilled artist and a person who decided to share their art teachings with people in courses and on his own YouTube channel, which I believe is also linked in the description here. So you guys should follow Brent for more free resources. But let's get to the good stuff. What are we looking at today, Brent?
We are doing a shading critique today. So for those of you who have been following my courses, everything everything is leading toward shading. So everything that we work on, the gesture, the volume and structure, all of that leads towards shading. And so shading is one of the things that takes a lot of preparation to be ready for it. But once you're there, if you've done the prep work for it, it is when the drawing really comes to life in a very three-dimensional way. So during this live stream, there are a couple of things I want to do. First, it's going to be a critique. So I'm going to be looking at student submissions, and I'm going to be going over what they've done well, where they can do some improvements. But I'm also going to be revisiting a lot of shading fundamentals. I want to make sure that I'm helping to build a solid mental model in the minds of students so they understand what the shading process is and what it looks like.
Okay, sounds good to me. I like this idea.
As always, for those of you who are watching live, questions are always appreciated. So, this is a good opportunity. If you have specific questions about the shading process, go ahead and ask them, and hopefully I can provide some information. So we'll hopefully make this a nice dynamic discussion.
Okay, yeah, sounds good to me. I'm going to get us over into that other layout.
Okay.
Let's try a couple. Let's see what works. That's the one.
There we go. Okay.
All right. So for anyone who is in the chat who is here from the actual course itself, please speak up if your work is going to be shown on screen or if you submitted anything, just in general. We'd like to know.
Yes. Yeah, today I will be looking at drawings from Marco, Martin, and Berten.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, so before we get into the critique, I want to talk about the shading process. And I'm going to try and include some ideas and a lot of images that weren't in the original courses. So just to make sure that I want to keep this fresh. So the first thing I want to introduce is my general shading process. Now, when I shade, and particularly when I'm teaching, I tend to use a 5-step shading process, and I use a 5-step value scale. And each step of the value scale corresponds to a specific value in the drawing. So before we even get into the figure, I'm going to pull a little diagram over, and I just want to talk everybody through it very briefly here. And again, understanding this is so critical before you start shading. So here I have a very simple sphere. It is lit with a single light source, and every single drawing that you're going to see from me and from students are from poses, from figures lit by a single light source. The single light source is the best way to get a full range of values, beautiful, brilliant highlights, really deep, mysterious shadows. So that is what I highly recommend people draw from. Now, I want to be very clear before I really get into the instruction that this 5-step process with a 5-step value scale, this is what makes the most sense to me. But I certainly don't want to give the impression that this is the only way to go about shading or that this is the correct way. So, but as an instructor, one of my jobs is to figure out how to take the incredibly complex information that we're going to be working with, in this case shading, and simplify it in a way that makes sense to students. I also want to note at the beginning that this is a simplification. Occasionally, students will say, "Oh, like you didn't talk about this shadow, or you missed this, or he doesn't know about this lighting condition." Like, yes, but I may not have covered it. But remember, these are the fundamentals. And so when we simplify these ideas, we necessarily have to skip some of the more minute or subtle details, but they can always be added in later. So my goal is to provide a really solid mental model for how the shading process works. Okay, so here we have my 5-step value scale. I usually refer to the light value as the number 1 value and the black value as the number 5 value. Some people like to switch those numbers, but that's how I tend to think about it. So we have the number 1 value is going to be the highlight value. The number 2 value is going to roughly be the midtone or center light value. The number 3 value is going to be our reflected light value. The number 4 value is going to be our core shadow value. And the number 5 is going to be our cast shadow value. Now, I've been debating whether or not I want to go into what all of these shadows are. My assumption is that if you're here in a figure drawing shading critique, you're going to have some understanding about what these terms mean. And if these are completely unfamiliar to you, I would recommend, going and revisiting some fundamentals. But these are the values that I'm going to be referring to, and I'll come back to this diagram so we can go over them. But now let me show you how these work in practice. And in doing so, I'll give you a sense of what all of these values are and what they mean. So here is a completed drawing, and I have a full series of images where I'm going to take you through this process. Now, one of the first things that's critical when you're shading is preparing your drawing for shading. So one of the most common things I see is people start shading before their drawing is ready. So before you start shading anything, you always want to make sure that all of the basic forms and proportions are all worked out. That's such a critical step. One of the most common mistakes I see is people starting to add value before figuring out, is that arm a little too long? Is that torso a little too wide? So once you start shading, you need to have already worked out the basic forms and proportions. So I just want to show you, so this here, we have an initial gesture drawing. And here we've started to place some basic line quality to define the forms. And so, okay, so this is about where I would want a drawing to be before I start shading. All the proportions are locked. Everything is placed where it needs to be. So the first step of the shading process that I would go through is I would separate light from shadow. And going back to that earlier image that we looked at of the sphere, you will notice that even though there are some subtle gradations, if you look right here, we see a moment where light goes into shadow, where the form turns away from the light and goes into shadow. So that moment we refer to as the line of termination. Some people call it the terminator. Some people call it the bedbug line. There are a lot of different names people give that. But I usually refer to it as the line of termination. So the first thing we want to do in the figure is to map out where that line occurs. You can see here, I've started to map out on the arm, and you can see here on the leg. I'm mapping out that line of termination, the moment where the figure moves out of the light and into shadow. And then the next thing I do is I just lay down a light wash of value at approximately a number 2 or 3 value. So this is, at this point, I'm keeping the lighting scheme incredibly simple. We only have 2 values. We have values that are a lit value in the light and a shadow value. At this stage, I'm not distinguishing between core shadow, reflected light, cast shadow. I'm just, anything that's a shadow, I am laying a light wash of value down. So that is the first step of the shading process. Next, I recommend defining the core shadow. So we're still working in the shadows here. So here you can see I've defined the core shadow. And for those of you who may be unfamiliar, remember the core shadow is that dark band of value that we tend to find right next to the reflected light. So for any of you who need some refreshers here, let's take a look at a quick cylinder. So you can see here is the lit side. Here is the line of termination, and we have this dark band of the core shadow that occurs right before we get to the reflected light. So you can see this light that's right here. And reflected light occurs because we have light that travels down from the light source, hits the surface that the object is sitting on, bounces up, and lights the bottom of the shadow. So hopefully you can all see that. And so that's what we're starting to do here. But of course, because we're working with the figure, the core shadow is much more complex. So we can see it kind of undulating down these forms. You see a bit of a simpler core shadow running down this way. So that is the second step of the shading process, is defining that core shadow. Now, of course, as soon as we darken the core shadow, you can see that we have some reflected light, right? So that was the initial wash of value, is approximately at that reflected light value. All right, so the next step is starting to define the cast shadows. Now, when we're dealing with a figure, in this kind of drawing, we are mostly dealing with the shadows that the figure is casting onto itself. So for example, here we have this arm casting a shadow onto the breast. And we do see, a slight bit of some cast shadow over on the right side, but we're mostly focused on the areas where the figure is casting a shadow over itself. Now, I want to remind everybody here that I am not darkening the values all the way down to what they will eventually be. That can come later. I like to give myself a lot of outs. I like to give myself some room to move. So, I tend to tiptoe up onto the values. So that is, so in this stage, we've just started to darken the cast shadows. We can mostly see them here in the armpit, on the breast. We can see the breast casting a shadow over the stomach right here. We can see the upper thigh casting a shadow onto the foot. And so that cast shadow value is the only place where we're going to use some of the darkest value that our pencil can make. So before I start to shift into the lights, wanted to check in. How am I doing, Stephen? Is this all making sense? Do we have any questions yet?
I mean, everything here sounds great so far. I was going to ask at one point the follow-up thing that you then immediately went into about reflected light. So this is perfect.
Great. Okay, great. Okay, so this is what I would want the drawing to look like before I step into the light. So far, we've dealt with 3 shadow conditions: the core shadow, reflected light, and cast shadow. And like I said, none of them are completely finished, but this is helping me to understand. So one of the things that I really try and present to students is a really straightforward process. So you always know where you are. So many students, when they're learning, engage in what I refer to as shadow chasing, which means that anywhere their eye falls, if there's a shadow there, they'll darken it a little bit. And to me, this just feels like utter chaos. I really want to make sure that I give students a clear and straightforward process so they always know where they are and what to do next. Okay, so next we start to move into the light. So I want you to, here's the core shadow. I want you to look at this arm here. So what we're going to do now is draw what is called the center light and the midtones. And I want to pull over this image here once again. So one of the things we tend to see on lit forms is of course, just like the shadow, the light is not distributed evenly. So if you look at this upper left edge of the cylinder, you can see it's brighter than this area right here before the cylinder turns away from the light. So you can see right next to the core shadow, on the lit side of the line of termination, it's darker than it is here. And so, so we want to capture that shift in the midtone from dark to light as the form moves toward the light source. So this is what I'm doing here. You can see here, starts at about a number 2 value. And in the light, as we move toward the light source, it gets a little lighter. So it's a really beautiful moment that we can start to capture. So here I've applied the center light and the midtone to everything. So you can see from the core shadow, as we move toward the light, it gets a little brighter. And to me, this is when the roundness of the form really starts to come out. So before I move on, I just want to reiterate this process. Again, step 1, divide light from shadow and darken all of the shadow areas to about a number 2 value. Step 2, define the core shadow, darken the core shadow to about a number 3 or 4 value. Next, cast shadows. So darken anywhere you see a cast shadow, and that's the 1 value you should use at a number 5 value. Next, you can start to move into the light by adding the center lights and some of the midtones. So at this stage, we've addressed all of the major light and shadow conditions. Again, yes, we're missing a lot of subtlety. We're missing some much more complex light and shadow conditions, but this will take you most of the way. And once I'm here, I start to go through the refinement process. So I take this simplified version and I start to add a lot more detail and complexity. But you'll note that these values that I've worked out remain throughout the entire process. So we can still see a clear division between light and shadow. We still have this organization of values. All the core shadows are roughly at a number 4 value. All the reflected light is roughly at a number 3 value. Cast shadows are roughly at a number 5. So this is the process that I'm going to be going through. This is the process that I teach in the course and that I'm going to be using to critique student work. So I just wanted to make sure that was really clear and that we understood this before we get into the critiques.
I agree. Definitely really important to get that out in the front. We do have a couple questions
yes.
that might have come up in light of the explanation.
Yes.
So this chatter Mengali asked, how would you give depth to a figure that is lit from the front, thus not a lot of areas where we can put big shadows?
Yeah, well, my first answer is not going to be very satisfying. It's that I would not draw from I would try not to draw from a figure lit from the front, because that does tend to flatten everything out.
Yeah, I think it's first and foremost, that is the most important answer. Like, if you have to do something for some reason, go ahead and do that thing. But even if someone gives you a portrait of somebody that has a certain lighting condition to it, you can reinvent and stylize, idealize the lighting.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. So that was going to be my next recommendation. I love it when we agree on things. So that would be my next recommendation is invent a light source. So one of the most amazing things about drawing these simplified, these more primitive forms is that you will learn how light and shadow work in some incredible ways. One of the most common things I draw are lit spheres, just like this. I have, I don't know, probably hundreds of them in my studio, and I still practice them because they're so instrumental in how light and shadow work. So you can invent a light source. If you understand how light works on a sphere, if you understand how light works on a cylinder, you can actually start to invent that. And it's important to remember, an arm is a cylinder, right? I will go into these a little bit later, but I'll bring them over just to show you now. I do a lot of these very simple kind of geometric drawings of lit figures, and these are really simplified, but the goal is to simplify the figure down to its most basic three-dimensional forms, and then try and simplify the lighting scheme. So you can see here on the leg, the upper portion of the leg is essentially an ovoid. So we see a bit of like a curved core shadow here. It shifts into more of a block-like form. So the more you practice these kinds of simplified drawings, the better prepared you'll be to invent light sources on objects.
Mm-hmm.
The third recommendation I would give, if you have to draw from a figure lit from the front and you're not confident inventing a light source, I would say the three-dimensionality can come from line quality.
Mm.
And I don't think I have any images that are really focused on line quality here. Let me see if I can pull something over. If you look at a drawing like this, you can see like the way these lines overlap each other. So those kinds of overlapping lines can go a long way at communicating three-dimensionality. So if we kind of zoom into this where we don't really see the shadow anymore, we're just left with line quality, hopefully you can start to see that this line is in front of this, which is in front of this, which is in front of this, which is in front of this. So in this tiny little area here, we have, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 overlaps, right? And so each one of those overlaps communicates that one thing is in front of another. So I would shift away from trying to do light and shadow using, I would shift away from trying to communicate three-dimensionality from light and shadow and shift more toward line quality.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
So there was a possibly a more in-depth answer than you were hoping for, but
I thought that was great. They did say thank you in the chat at a couple points here. So
good,
that's good.
Good.
We do have a couple other questions. Would you like those?
Please.
All right. So there's one from Jiva who asks, what makes highlights so important?
So I will give you a couple of different answers. So first of all, I like drawings that have a lot of drama to them. And to create drama, we need a full range of light and shadow. And if you take a look at this sphere here, if you imagine it without the highlight, it would just seem a little dull. It would seem to be missing something. To me, it almost seems like a passage in a song where like the last note is missing. It just feels unfinished. It doesn't have a resolution to it. Mm-hmm. That being said, highlights tend to occur on objects that have a shinier surface. So you don't always get a highlight if something is dull. If you were drawing a tennis ball, something is fuzzy, right? You're not going to see a highlight on that. So that would be one thing. Another is highlights are a way to show the direction of the light source. And so you can see this tends to give us, a sense of where the light source is coming from. And it also tends to give us a sense of how reflective the object is. So I'm going to pull in, again, a few different kinds of drawings here. So this is a drawing done on white paper. And so, the highlights here are pretty subtle, but you can see like, right here along the spine, or we can see, or the muscles running up along the spine, we can start to see some basic highlights. And so, if that were all just grayed out, I don't think we would have the kind of drama. Now, one thing I really love to do is shade on toned paper. So I'm going to zoom in here so you can, let's get real close. So you can see the highlights here are pretty subtle, right? So you can see they are right here. Now, this is, again, getting pretty specific, but hopefully you're all ready for that. I want you to take a look at the nature of the highlights right here on the muscle of the shoulder and the strands of the latissimus dorsi. They are light, but they're sort of like a hazy light. They're not fully a number one value, and they don't have really defined edges. And so I think it creates a nice subtle effect of the flesh kind of over muscle there. So I'm going to pull back again so you can kind of get a sense of what that looks like from a distance. But there are two areas. What, Stephen? What?
Was that on purpose?
What? Oh,
you zoomed in and you went straight to the butt. It was perfect if done intentionally.
Then yes. However, I want you to take a look at the highlight right here. So this is the acromion process. So this is a bone coming to the surface. You can see that highlight has a firmer edge. We can also see a greater highlight right at the tip of the nose. So those are more defined than the highlights that are on the musculature. And so, if I pull back again, you can still see them. Those are different in nature. So the reason that the highlight right there on that bone sticking up has a more defined edge is because the bone is right underneath the surface. The skin is stretching taut, and it creates a much more defined highlight. So that's the kind of information you can start to convey. And again, we're getting into some kind of really specific light and shadow ideas here, but it's those kinds of details I love. So whenever there's a bone sticking up right underneath the skin, I like to give it a much more defined highlight. Also, so the nose tends to be a place where, I hope this isn't abject, but the nose tends to be a place where, we have a little a little more grease on the skin, right? And that creates a greater highlight. So these are they're just really subtle pieces of information you can start to communicate with highlights. Also, we have the bone of the wrist sticking up right here. We have the radius sticking up at the wrist right there. And again, you can see a nice little sharp highlight there. Now, again, these are really small pieces of information, but I really think they start to add a lot to drawings. And so if you imagine these kinds of drawings, without these highlights, I really think they'd start to lose something.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah. Oh, go ahead, Stephen.
Highlights are immensely important. I think that you can use them for a bunch of different purposes, like you were saying. They can be just for pulling attention as something, or something that's supposed to communicate something about the texture of it. That's why you see them get deployed in weird areas and they stick out. Like a lot of times, I love anime, but anime has a real loose use with highlights sometimes. So,
yeah, they draw the eye. So
yeah.
Here's a figure drawing done on pretty dark paper. So you can see the highlights are probably pushed a little further than they should, than is realistic, let's say. But again, I think it adds an interesting sense of drama to the drawing. So, all right. So hopefully that answered the question about why highlights are important, some different things you can do with them.
There's just one more quick one that I think you can choose to take in a couple different directions.
Okay.
So earlier here, we had a question. I can't necessarily find it in this chat right now because we had some more go by. But they were asking, what would you do with occlusion shadows? They didn't really give too much of a follow-up of how they mean this while you were breaking things down. So just real quickly, I wanted to make sure and let them know it also depends on how many values you plan to give to your drawing.
Yeah. So one thing I want to say, again, just to revisit this idea, I've been using this 5-step value scale. When I'm drawing away from the eyes of students, when it's just me in my studio, I'm not being teacher Brent, I don't adhere to this as strictly as I'm teaching it. And I think that's really important to note. The goal is not that you as students strictly adhere to this process years from now. The goal of this is to build a strong mental model of how the most important values work. Mm-hmm. If you do a drawing that doesn't distinguish between an occlusion shadow and a penumbra, the vast majority of people will not notice or care, right? Like you can actually get away with shading with only, like, I think a drawing starts to work at about 3 values, right? And I mean, you can even get it to work with 2 if you're really skilled at simplifying. So a lot of these more subtle things. So I should put out there, I think it's great to ask these questions, and I think it's wonderful to be thinking about these things. I also want to make sure that you're not terribly worried about things like occlusion shadows until you are really good at the more basic, core shadow, reflected light, simplified cast shadow forms.
Mhm.
You work on those first before you start to worry about some of the more subtle things. That being said, let me talk about how I understand the occlusion shadow. So the occlusion shadow, or how I tend to use this term and think about it, is you can see here that the cast shadow is not all a single value. So you can see over here on the right side, this is a lighter value than it is under here. So the occlusion shadow is that moment where light is blocked entirely from hitting an adjacent surface, and it is the darkest part of the cast shadow. So when I'm drawing the figure, I often don't draw the entire rendered cast shadow. I often let it kind of fade out. So you can see here, I do have a darker cast shadow right to the side of the figure here, and then it kind of fades out. Let me pull in a couple more finished drawings. Let's see here. See if I can find some good. Yeah, you can see here again, like I'm not trying to capture the really specific shape of the cast shadow all the way across. I'm kind of being loose because I want the focus to be much more on the anatomy and the light and shadow on the form itself. But so you can see though that there is more darkness in the occlusion shadow area, then it gets lighter as we shift away from the figure. So, Stephen, do you have anything to add to this?
I'm glad that you talked about not needing to worry about that early on. That's my biggest thing. When they asked, I was trying to ask them in the text chat here what it was that they were worried about with it, because it's a pretty broad thing. I think by and large, when you're dealing with something that's this early on in your learning, you can just group it together with the rest of your darkest values. You don't necessarily have to go through and put it all in there, but know that some areas where you increase the thickness of a line, it might look like an occlusion shadow.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what we saw in the foot here. Yeah. So a lot of time under here, it's just an increased thickness in the line. I do this a lot with the feet too, because I feel like it grounds the figure.
Yeah,
So I
absolutely.
do nice dark heavy lines where the figure comes in contact with the ground plane. And going back to this, you can see done that here as well. But it's important to note in the reference photo, this cast shadow, of course, extended all the way out and created a very specific shape. But if you can imagine, this dark cast shadow shape over here, it just draws a lot of attention away from the figure. So what I've done here is I've done just a really simple cast shadow and let it fade out. And you can see, like, technically, there it is. There's the occlusion shadow, but then it fades out, and I haven't defined the rest of the shadows. So a lot of these, end up being very subjective choices that you can make depending on the kind of drawing that you're interested in doing.
Absolutely. This is perfect. You asked earlier if there was anything I wanted to say. That was perfect, Brent. This is everything I wanted from this answer.
Wonderful. Okay, good. I do aim to please when I'm working with students. So, okay, so I think it's about time to head over and take a look at some student work. So, and I know, Stephen, at some point we're going to switch over. I was hoping to get a sense of how soon you want to do that. Whenever works for you, works for me.
Let's go through one chunk, like one student's work.
Okay.
For the critiques, and then from there we can see what sticks. See if we decide to roll over it yet or not. Just as a reminder for anyone who again does want to, who is part of the course and wants to join that one, that is on the course page. You guys can just hang out in that chat already on the YouTube page or the Proko page.
All right. So here we have work by Marco. So Marco was kind enough to provide a sequence of drawings. I believe these are all from the same drawing, even though the color of the paper looks different in these. That's very common. Cameras, particularly phone cameras, have very difficult time reading white paper and colored paper as well, actually. But I'm assuming these are all actually the same drawing. I'm rather confident they are. So
I think you're right.
so we're at least going to proceed as if they are. So here on the left, we have Marco's worked out the basic proportions of the figure, and I think this is done pretty well. Nothing is really striking me as being wildly out of proportion or not making any sense, so nice work there. And Marco was applying the first step of the shading process, which is to divide light from shadow and to start to define the core shadow. So this is kind of step 1 and step 2. So a few things that I want to talk about first. One is that I would have pushed the line quality a little bit further before I started to add some shading. And for those of you who are going through all of the courses, I know the ideas are split up. There's gesture, there's volume and structure, there's shading. But the goal is that once you're in the shading course, we're not forgetting about gesture. We're not forgetting about volume and structure and line quality. It's assumed that you're bringing all of that knowledge into here. So don't be afraid to work out line quality, come in with more three-dimensional elements, overlaps, and before you start to add the shading to the drawing. And ultimately, line quality and light and shadow work together to create a very powerful experience. And I'll talk. Oh, actually, why don't I cover that again? Let's go back to this drawing, just to show you what I mean. So when we look at a drawing like this, let's take a look at the upper arm here. Of course, there's no dark outline around any part of the subject or any part of the figure, right? It's not that I looked at the figure and saw this dark outline, but I made a choice to make the drawing more interesting. And so we see on the underside of some of these forms a bit of a darker line. This is a bit of a taut line to kind of express that tricep is a little flexed there. Here you can see I've added a nice dark angular line with the olecranon process. It's kind of bulging out. That bone is coming right underneath the surface. So these are all things you can start to do. You can start to add some of these things before you start the shading process. And I would often encourage you to start doing those things. But that being said, again, this is a pretty successful preparation for shading. Mm-hmm. So I think the line of termination is well observed. And one of the things I can see it kind of moving around the bone of the elbow there. I can see this nice straight line of termination going down the cylindrical form of the arm. I can see these. I really love these almost like serrated edges as it moves down the figure. And that's one of the things that really makes a drawing sing, where you have these nice serrated forms that are moving down the line of termination. I can see a harder edge for the cast shadow. So again, the line of termination looks well observed. What I would say could use some improvement, two things. One, this is a pretty hard line to be at the line of termination for that core shadow. And it's important to note that the line of termination is not hard edged, right? So if you look at this sphere, you can see there's a gradation there. So one of the really common things we tend to see is students create these really long gradations from, dark to light, and it kind of moves, like a really slow gradation. And that's not what we see, but we also don't see a hard edge. So I would say this is a firm edge, you might say. It's not hard, it's not soft, but it's got kind of a firmness to it. And so capturing that kind of edge early on in a drawing is really important. So I would say using a much a softer edge at the core shadow for the line of termination. And one of the reasons I think that's important is, if we go all the way over, we can still see in some of these areas, right along here, the line of termination is still a little too hard edged. right? And it tends to give it a almost like a chrome sort of look. I think it can look a little strange when you're rendering flesh. So when you're first laying down that line of termination, or the core shadow edge at the line of termination, make sure you're using a line that's not too hard, not too soft, because we want to communicate roundness, and those hard edges tend to communicate a shift in a plane, not a curved rounding surface. And you can start to think about that even as you're in this simple process. One thing, so down here at the leg, if you can see down here, the line of termination that's running right along here, that actually is a softer edge line. I think it's already more successful. So that starts to look a little more rounded. So that's great. But I think particularly at the breast and the arm, I would have loved to have seen a softer line. So yeah, any thoughts here, Stephen?
There was one thing.
Yes.
It does kind of look like they did try to knock some of that back as they went through. There's some areas where it did soften a little bit. Like we have just under, like here at the insertion of the breast, like where it comes in, that part looks like it did soften out considerably. Like I don't know if they chose to erase it or what they were even using as their tool.
Yeah.
I think that they probably got to the end of it and or that midpoint where they'd already sunk so much time in there and realized they had to knock it back. That's the point of that, like that long layout stage that you were talking about. So you set yourself up for success.
Yeah. Now, one thing that I really like in this first drawing is check out the edge of the cast shadow that we're finding right here on the neck that's cast by the ear, as well as this line right here under the breast.
Yeah.
So he's laying out the edge of the cast shadow. Now, a cast shadow edge is hard edged, right? And so that's exactly where we would want to see those lines. So I really like that that you're starting to think about some of those things. So it's just that, let me remove my arrows here. If we look at the cast shadow edge right next to, going across the neck, and we compare it to the edge of the core shadow on the upper arm, these are very close, right? And ideally, we would want those to be different kinds of edges because they're communicating different things. So hopefully I'm making sense there. But again, I want to note here, submitting your work for critique, particularly on a live stream, is I know it can be a scary thing, and I really want to make sure that I'm providing not just feel-goodery, but making sure I'm giving you practical steps on how to improve next time. So.
Yeah.
Okay, so now let's move on to the second part of the second image here in the middle. So a lot of the things that some of the hard edges were resolved nicely, and I can see Marco is starting to add some nice line quality as well. So that's great. So you can see here there's some darkening of the left edge of the rib cage under the breast. So that's nice. And I can start to see that some of these areas of shadow have been softened a bit. So in this middle drawing, it looks like Marco is starting to add the center light and the midtones. So he's moving out of the shadow and into the light. Now, this is always a tricky thing to do because the lit areas do have multiple values. You have lighter areas and darker areas. But one of the common mistakes students make, and I'm not saying Marco make this mistake, but I'm just using this as an opportunity to talk about this. Students will see a dark area like this area right here that's defining the underside of the rib cage, the thoracic arch here, and they'll think, that's dark. It must be a shadow. Like, no, just because something is darker than something else does not mean it's a shadow, right? So both midtones and center lights are areas of light. Just because you add some darkness there doesn't mean they're shadows. So that's one really critical thing to note. I want to pull over Just while we're talking about this, this is a diagram that I used in the course, but I created this weird little object where I took an egg shape and then I put these sort of lumps on these sort of half circle lumps on it to show how they change in the light. And so again, I'm always looking for ways to simplify complex visual information. So while we're looking at this form, we can see that this first lump, it has a really bright highlight on it, right? And then it gets darker, but no part of this value here is a shadow, right? So just because it's darker doesn't mean it's a shadow. So if you look at this value, it's not as dark as the reflected light or the core shadow, right?
Mhm.
And so this is just something that's really critical for students to understand. So that's on the upper left portion of this form, and it's the one closest to the light source. This next lump we have has a highlight, not quite as bright. And so you get a lot of these on the figure, and they can be kind of infuriating. So we do see on the lower right of this form, we get about a number 4 core shadow value. But because it doesn't curve all the way back and around, we don't see reflected light on it, right? So you really want to start to understand how these more specific light and shadow conditions operate. And it's not until we get this lump here on the lower right that is on the line of termination where we see a full range of value with the core shadow and reflected light underneath. And because of its placement, we do see light, but we don't have a highlight on that form.
Mhm.
So anyway, I wanted to see how light operated on this kind of form. And so I think, hopefully this does a good job at kind of showing, it's very simple, but hopefully it does a good job at showing how these lumps and bumps on the figure operate. And these kinds of lumps and bumps could stand in for anything, right? Could stand in for a muscle that's bulging, could stand in for a bit of bone that's underneath the surface. But again, I'm always looking for these ways to simplify these ideas.
I think this is a really handy one. I like this a lot. It's a very good example. Hossein in the chat asked, why is the highlight on the upper bump bigger?
So because it's facing the light more directly. And so it appeared brighter when I was drawing it. It's also possible, this is a kind of a weird form. I kind of crafted a few of these. I think I made one out of clay. I made one out of slicing potatoes and sticking things to them and sticking it under the light. So I don't remember quite which one this was. It's also possible that the area of the clay or the skin of the potato operated a little differently. This is but this is I find a really useful diagram. Now the other thing I wanted to show related to the lumps and bumps on the lit side of the form of the figure are these kinds of. Okay, so here is a lump, right? And it doesn't go, we don't see a core shadow because it doesn't curve all the way around. So we just start to see, it's starting to turn away from the light. So this area isn't as bright as over here, but we don't, it doesn't go into shadow. But the lumps and bumps on the figure tend not to have such a clear-cut, defined edge. So we often have to imply these forms. If you see here on the right, this is often what we tend to find. So we don't get these defined edges. So I try to just kind of blow up a section of a drawing that has much softer edges where it looks just like something's kind of pressing up from underneath, but you don't have these defined edges. So this is the effect that I would often create. I want you to note how soft these edges are. So let's keep all of this in mind when we go back to Marco's work, is we can start to get a sense. So I want everybody to look here at the rib cage right here and the shadow right here, the shadow shape that we have that's right underneath it. So the shadow shape is communicating the thoracic arch, the underside of the rib cage here. And we can see it gets, this plane here is lighter. But I would like to see more softness. Again, this is probably the right value, but the edges I just think are a little too hard. It kind of communicates more of a plane shift. It starts to look very angular there. And so I would want, to me, again, it is the difference between having a defined edge here and having a much more softer edge. We want it to look like it's rounded. And so that's something I'm seeing in a few areas where some of the midtones, the edges are just a little too hard. I want to see a little more softness there. I would like to say that the core shadow on the upper arm has been softened. That edge has been softened a little, although I think it still might be a little too hard. And the core shadow on the breast has been softened a bit as well. It's starting to work. Marco, you've done a nice job adding some kind of subtle information on the upper chest here. So that's working really well. And those kinds of subtle bits of information go such a long way toward adding complexity to a drawing. And again, like I want to go back to this drawing just to show you these ideas in action. So if you take a look at an area here, this is so close to those weird little protrusions here. Like you can really start to see like how that plays out. And you can see like when you get up close to that kind of information, people are often surprised. Like they're very subtle and they're very soft edged, right? Try to have some like pretty I mean, you get up close and they almost just fall apart, right? Like there's very little information there, and a little bit goes a long way. And again, now that we're this close to this part of the drawing, I want you to take a look at how little pigment is there and how soft and subtle it is. And so this is all you need. When we back up, it goes a long way. Those soft, subtle pieces of information go a long way. And again, I'd like you to compare them to this. It's just, it's probably a little too dark and a little too hard edged. So a few other notes here. In the navel, I'd like to see a little more darkness and definition. Now, I do want to note that I understand this is part of the process, and some of these things do get resolved later on. But I just want to make sure, you're keeping in your head all of these ideas at once. Bless you, Stephen.
I was trying to mute myself. Apologies.
All right. So, I wanted to check in before we move on. Stephen, any thoughts? Anything you want to share?
No further questions currently.
Okay. All right.
And this is great.
Okay. All right. So now let's move on to this third one. So this is the final stage of refinement. This is the last drawing that was submitted, so I will assume that it's the last drawing, that this is the final version of the drawing. So there's a lot that's working well here. And so again, we can see, the cast shadow edge here is really nice. We can start to see darker values. So this is a bit subtle, but when we're talking about cast shadows, some of the darkest cast shadows in the drawing are found underneath the very bottom here. And so I just might want to remember, and the darkest and lightest areas of the drawing are often going to pull the most attention. So you just want to make sure, like, you want to make a decision about where you want people to look. And so when you have some of the darkest areas kind of down here, it does pull the eye, and just, you want to ask that question. So I might have placed some more darkness where she's seated. And one of the reasons is, if you look at this foot here, now again, visually speaking, this cast shadow under the foot would probably be one of the darker ones, would be at least as dark as the cast shadow where she's sitting. But in terms of a drawing, and in terms of communicating an idea, I would have made the cast shadow where she's sitting darker. And there are a couple reasons. One is that I always like to keep the focus on the figure itself. So that would be one reason. The second thing is that the vast majority of her weight that she's putting, the gravity is pulling her down, is on this seat. You can see she's lifting this foot up. She's not putting a bunch of weight on that foot. And so dark values not only communicate a lack of light, dark values in a drawing can also communicate weight and heft. And so I like the idea of putting some of those dark lines underneath here to say, she's putting her weight all right here. And I would kind of let this get a little lighter to say, yes, it's a cast shadow, but she's not putting weight. Now this is, again, this can be a tricky idea to communicate. But remember, in drawing, the point is not hyper accuracy. The point is not to draw an image where the physics are all correct, right? Or I mean, that can be a goal, but I always think, remember, drawing is a communication tool. It is a form of communication, and one of the great things about drawing is we can go beyond what is visible to communicate other ideas. And so, using darkness, thick lines to communicate weight, it's not something you see visibly, but it's an idea that registers in the drawing, right? And we're already doing that to some degree. If we take a look right underneath the rib cage here, that was some smooth screen switching, Stephen.
Thank you. I'm trying.
If you take a look at right underneath the breast here, you've got this darker line quality. Like, that's not something you observed, right? You made a decision to bring some emphasis there. That's great, right? And so we're breaking what we see to communicate ideas all the time. And, I really like to see that in student work. Mm-hmm. All right, so a couple of other thoughts here. The core shadow here on the upper arm has gotten a little thicker, which is great. But the core shadow on the leg is the same thickness. Now, the larger the form, the thicker core shadow we would expect to see. So I think this darker band could be much thicker on the leg to communicate. This is a larger form, right? So the smaller the form, the more kind of narrow the core shadows will get. So there's just a lot of these subtle details that I think could start to bring a greater sense of realism to the drawing. Mm-hmm. So this model is Stephanie. This is actually the same model that I use for this drawing. And so I just wanted to kind of compare a few things here. So in this drawing, hopefully you can see here on the leg, the core shadow is thicker than it is on the upper arm, right? And that is because the leg is a larger form, so we get a thicker core shadow. We can also see, how this kind of firm edge that we've talked about. So it's not a hard line. And you can see in a lot of the subtle details in the lit side, again, there's just a softness there that makes it look more fleshy. And when you compare, you can see areas that are right here under this rib that's poking through. It's pretty hard edged, right? And so we'd want to see something that's a little bit softer. But all in all, Marco, I would say, very nice work. You've come a long way. And, I would highly encourage you to stick with each step a little longer. And so you can start to think through some of these intricacies at each step of the way. And so the more you can bring to the process, the more that all of these will shine through. And on that note, I want to say, I've said this in other critiques, but I think it's such an important idea. Drawing is a transparent medium. When you draw something, you see every stroke all the way back through the drawing, right? And so that is how complexity should build. Every pass you make, you can add a little bit more complexity. And at the end of a drawing, remember, all those little decisions you're making end up being visible all the way through. So you're not covering things up per se. It's not like oil paint where things get covered up and then what's underneath disappears. So I really like that idea of building complexity by adding layers. So.
Yeah, absolutely. There was one thing that, if you're okay with it, I'd like to ask a question about for you.
Sure.
So here in this piece, they're doing a thing that I think is used often in your work to communicate something in particular, with where the bottom half of that leg, the back leg, it fuzzes out, you know, and that happens as well with that arm on the top.
Yes.
This, I think, is a very well put together piece so far for someone who's following along with the course. Would you have agreed with the decision to throw that arm back in that way?
Would I have agreed with the decision? Well,
I think the leg, it makes sense. It's moving back much more in space. I do not think that arm is.
Yeah, okay. So let me pull up the original. I'm not gonna bring the original photo, obviously, because this is YouTube and
The YouTube overlords have thoughts about that.
yes, yes. Okay, so I'm taking a look. So let me see. Let me see. I'm gonna do something a little risky. I'm gonna try and crop the original photo so you don't see anything nude, and I'm gonna bring it over. Okay.
This works
So
for
all
me.
right, YouTube overlords. Okay,
Nailed it.
so looking at the reference photo, we can see that the hand is actually resting, on the shoulder, and so we get it's a beautiful moment where we have these beautiful shadows of the fingers kind of placed on the shoulder. Were I doing a more finished drawing of this, I probably would have included that. Now, when you use the language, Stephen, that you're not sure that you agree, and like I totally see it.
That's
Part
I
of
yeah.
Go ahead, go ahead.
No, I got you on that one. Yeah, the wording choice. You do whatever you want to in art. You don't
Yeah,
have. No one has to agree with you. You don't have to agree with anybody else.
yeah. Yeah, and that's a critical thing. As I said before, drawing is all about communication.
Mhm.
And when the most like simple, I mean, it's almost stupidly simple, but after you get through all the technical stuff, all the anatomy, all the physics of light, really what a drawing comes down to is just like, what do you think is cool about this? Like
Mhm.
a finished drawing is just a way to say, I thought this was beautiful or interesting, and I wanted to share it with you, the viewer.
Yeah.
That's what a drawing is, right? And so if that part didn't strike Marco as being particularly interesting, okay, like, I'm not going to argue with that.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, I think, were it me, I think it's a beautiful moment. I probably would have liked to have seen, those fingertips there. But yeah, but I agree because it does look a little odd. And part of what I think you're seeing, Stephen, if I'm going to be really hypercritical of you, Marco, sorry,
Mhm.
um, because the atmospheric perspective, and is that the language
Yeah.
that you
Mhm.
use, Stephen? Yeah, when you're kind of like making a decision to let something fade out into the background by not rendering it. Should I define atmospheric perspective a little more?
If you'd like to, yeah, I think it happened. People want it in like cinematography and other
Yeah.
things. People are getting more familiar with this. I think it's important to go over.
Okay. Okay. So it's also often referred to as aerial perspective. So if you can imagine looking out over a vast landscape, what you're likely to see is the objects that are closest to you are going to have the most contrast. They're going to have the darkest darks and the lightest lights, and they're going to be the most defined. The further away you get, objects tend to lose contrast, right? Which is why you look at distant mountains. If you look at the shadows, they almost look like a light blue, right?
Mhm.
So the darks are sucked out. And the hazier the day, the more soft and sort of, they almost start to look like they dissolve, right? Now, this is something that we see over vast distances. The particles in the air literally suck out the contrast, suck out the darks, and they tend to obscure and make things distant objects. They can make them start to look hazy. Now, we would never see this in a studio where we have a figure, right? We
Mhm.
just wouldn't see that. But we can use that as a drawing tool. And that is one of my very favorite drawing tools to use. Let me pull over a few drawings. I use it all the time in drawing.
Mhm.
So in this one, you can see here that I've let this leg go away, and again, it almost looks like it's lost in a fog, right?
Yeah.
Now
Exactly.
we would never see this. Like when I drew this in the reference photo for this, that leg is just as visible as any other part of the body. Um, but I love to use atmospheric perspective to bring some things forward and push some things back. I often joke that there is nothing flatter than a sheet of paper. And so when we draw, like we have to use whatever ways we can to try and break the flatness of that sheet of paper and to
Mhm.
create that illusion of depth. And the human brain intuitively understands that things that don't have a full range of value and that are hazy are further away,
Mhm.
right? We would never see it, in this scale, but we intuitively understand it and we can start to use it in our drawings. So you can see here I've done something similar, like I've let this leg fade away. Although I will say I use it inconsistently, right? So this leg is just, I just thought the composition worked a little better by letting this leg fade out. So, there aren't really specific rules here, right?
Yeah. No, there's like you can imply a few different things with it. It can also kind of feel like a motion blur, you know?
Yeah, for sure.
I think the thing that kind of stuck out to me is that because we do see so much of that arm itself, we know the angle of what that arm is going to do and where it's going, and it will make contact with something that has that hard edge. So it loses this internal consistency of the logic. You don't always have to do that. Absolutely do it wherever you want. Just know where there will be parts, like you said, how people understand intuitively something being hazy or foggy. It's probably distant. There are some other things that you will take away from an implied visual, like that hard edge that you were talking about. It implies a hard plane change. Not having this where you expect to see that hand to be there, you start looking at it and you internally feel that something is wrong and you start to question it.
Yes, and let me know if you agree with this, Stephen. So what I'm saying is, for that hand and arm to kind of fade away as they were, the arm would have to be in a position where the wrist would have to break for it to be going behind further. Like there's something that looks like the human body wouldn't work that way. And again, Marco, we are being so critical,
absolutely,
like,
yeah,
hypercritical. Like,
yeah, we're going in on this thing, and it's going to be a thing that you're going to think about in the future. You're going to go, no, I can't put this out. It's fine. We've all done the worst things before that we didn't think about during it. Where someone's like, why did you make that choice? And you're like, oh my god. There's nothing bad or wrong here. It's just there are some things that you might unintentionally imply to somebody.
Yep, and it's important to note too, Marco, that if I gave Stephen any of my drawings and said go at him, he'd find similar things in my finished work as well. So it happens, right?
And if you go look at anything that I've posted, I don't make wonderful perfect art. Like it is not the case here. This is just for the purpose of teaching.
Yeah. Yeah, and so so I wanted to bring up this drawing so you can see it's kind of a similar. Like I've got one arm that's in the front that's a much more specific, and this other arm, I haven't even made a decision. Like, well, which is the right edge? Is it this one? Is it this one? Those are way too long, and so it's okay. And I like to let some of these dynamic lines kind of exist there. Another use here is you were brought up
the ghosting
blur,
lines.
Steven.
Yeah. I like these in your work.
Yeah, I love this effect, and it's pushed a little here. This was a demo that I did to kind of show how it worked, but like you can use this effect to start to imply a path of motion. So I think it's very interesting. Another thing I'll often do is kind of add these atmospheric lines, and again, it's almost like a fog that kind of engulfs some of the visual information. So these are some of the kind of fun things. Now, again, this is going a little bit beyond just straight up shading, right? So these are some of the things you can do. But the goal is that if you look at the rest of the drawing, hopefully enough of it's believable and anatomically accurate, working well enough that it grounds the drawing in reality. And students will trust you a little more when you start to play with the line and play with different things to communicate in drawings. So,
thank you for allowing me a questionable nitpick.
Oh, of course. I love your questions, Stephen.
I just wanted to ask that one. And I can see plenty of ways that, plenty of things that motivated that choice. It's a strong jawline, a strong profile line, wanting to try to preserve that. I absolutely understand. Do some science, try some different ways, have a good time, see what works.
Yeah, for sure. It's also possible that he drew it a little further and didn't like the way it looked and made it a conscious decision. And he may not agree with us, and that's totally fine. So
yeah, absolutely.
So Stephen, I know you said that we go through this one, then maybe we'd switch over. So just wanted to check in with you about time.
Yeah, there was one question from Jay in here that asked. We've gotten some distance from the time that they had asked the question. I think that this is while you were showing some of your work. JR asked, I noticed that the subjects are muscular, but in the drawings you expose a lot of adipose tissue and it looks exaggerated. Is that an artistic choice?
Yeah, so so one thing that that happens when I draw. So when I go to a live drawing group, and the models will frequently come up and say like, "Wow, am I really that muscular?"
Yes, absolutely. 100%. You're so buff.
Yes. Yeah, I tend to exaggerate a lot of things in these. Like if you saw the original poses or reference photos, yeah, I exaggerate quite a bit. And again, like I think when you're learning, it's probably good to try and play it straight and to it's probably good to play it straight and to try and observe mostly what you're seeing. But you also know that, again, drawing is a communication tool. No drawing is going to be perfect. And so it just allows um, for some exaggeration and some artistic license. So
Mhm.
yeah. So yeah, I do exaggerate quite a bit. All right, Stephen, are we about ready
I think
to
so.
shift over?
Yeah.
All right.
So just as a reminder for everyone who is here on YouTube, the second half of this is going to be for the premium students who are already part of Brent's course. That can be you if you want to join it. You can get that over at proko.com/Eviston. You should join. It's a very good course. I hope that you've liked the things you've seen here so far. But to everyone else, roll on over to that course. There should be a link in the description to get you over there. We'll see you guys over that way. Thanks for joining us here on YouTube. All right. That has been ended. All you special people who are still here, you're part of the course.